there exists a place beyond the reach of daylight and reason, a threshold where the known world dissolves into shadow and the boundaries between existence and non-existence become as fragile as morning mist. This is the realm we explore today, a space carved from centuries of Irish and Scottish folklore, where death is not merely an ending, but a battlefield, where the dead wage war for the souls of the dying, and where the rejected damned circle endlessly through the darkness, forever hunting, forever starving, forever denied the peace that should follow mortality. Welcome to a journey through one of the most haunting legends ever preserved in the oral traditions of the Celtic lands, the legend of the Sluagh. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a windswept moor in the Scottish Highlands, or along the wild coasts of Ireland's western shores. The sun has descended below the horizon, leaving behind only a bruised and fading light that clings to the sky like a dying breath. The wind carries with it the scent of salt and something else, something ancient and unfamiliar, a presence that makes the hair on your arms rise despite the mild temperature. Around you, the landscape seems alive with waiting, as if the earth itself is holding its breath for something inevitable to occur. This is the moment when the veil between our world and theirs grows thin, when the impossible becomes tangible, and when the rules that govern the living cease to hold any authority. For centuries, the people of Ireland and Scotland lived with the understanding that the boundary separating the living from the dead was not a solid wall, but rather a permeable membrane, a place where entities from the other world could cross into ours, where the restless dead could press against the windows of our reality, and where malevolent forces operated according to laws entirely foreign to human comprehension. But not all spirits that crossed this threshold were equal in their hunger, or that some came with warnings, some came with grief, and some came with an appetite so profound, so desperate, that they would stop at nothing to claim what they needed most, a human soul at the precise and sacred moment of death. These beings are the Sluagh, a name whispered in Irish and Scottish folklore that translates to the host or the fairy host, though these terms capture only a fraction of their true meaning. They are not fairies in the sense of delicate, luminous creatures found in modern fantasy literature. The Sluagh exist in a category entirely their own. They are the damned. They are souls so profoundly wicked, so corrupted by their earthly transgressions, that neither heaven would accept them, nor hell would claim them. Caught between salvation and damnation, they were cast into an eternal state of rejection and hunger. They are neither alive nor dead, neither fully corporeal nor entirely spectral. They exist in a state of permanent limbo, a consequence of wickedness so extreme that the very structure of the afterlife rejected them. The terror inspired by the Sluagh stems not merely from their existence, but from their singular, overwhelming purpose. They are hunters of the dying. When a person lies on their deathbed, when the body weakens and the spirit prepares to depart, the Sluagh sense this moment with preternatural precision. They circle and descend, not out of mercy or any comprehensible motivation, but out of a hunger that has gnawed at them across centuries without satisfaction. They seek to capture the soul at the exact instant it leaves the body, to claim it for themselves before it can pass on to whatever judgment awaits in the afterlife. This is not mere folklore born from misunderstanding or primitive superstition. This belief was so deeply embedded in Irish and Scottish culture that families developed elaborate rituals and customs specifically designed to protect their dying loved ones from this supernatural predation. But here is where your understanding of this legend must expand beyond simple fear. The Sluagh represents something far more profound than a creature-based threat. They embody an entire cultural mythology surrounding death, judgment, morality, and the consequences of human action. They serve as a cosmic mirror reflecting the anxieties of peoples living on the edge of survival, facing winter's darkness, disease, and the ever-present knowledge that death could arrive unexpectedly. The Sluagh were not invented as entertainment or casual storytelling. They were born from a deeply serious engagement with the sacred boundary between life and death, from the profound question of what happens to souls that are condemned and rejected, and from the desperate human need to believe that we can somehow protect those we love from forces entirely beyond our control. As we prepare to descend deeper into this legend together, I invite you to join the community at Echoes of the Old World, where we explore the forgotten histories and neglected myths that shaped human consciousness. Subscribe to our channel to receive the complete journey through the Sluagh's origins, their hunting methods, and the rituals that generations developed to resist them. Your support helps us preserve these powerful narratives for those who hunger for authentic cultural connection and historical understanding. Before we proceed further into the darkness, tell us in the comments below, from which part of the world are you watching this journey into Irish and Scottish folklore? What draws you to these ancient stories of the supernatural? Your engagement fuels our mission to keep these narratives alive. What you are about to discover across these chapters is not merely a ghost story told for entertainment around a dying fire. What follows is an exploration of a complete cosmological system, a framework that ancient and medieval peoples used to make sense of morality, consequence, and the ultimate mystery of what lies beyond the threshold of death. The Sluagh waited there in that darkness, hungrier and more desperate with each passing century. And their story begins where all terrible things begin, at the moment when the boundary between worlds grows dangerously, impossibly thin. To understand the Sluagh, you must first comprehend a terrible truth that lies at the heart of Celtic spiritual cosmology. There exists a category of damnation so profound, so absolute, that it transcends the very framework of good and evil that structures the afterlife. In Christian theology, even the most wicked souls face a binary choice: heaven or hell, salvation or punishment, eternal light or eternal fire. But the Sluagh exist outside this framework entirely. They represent a third state, a rejection so complete that they were cast out by both divine and infernal forces alike. To be Sluagh is to occupy a space of absolute isolation, neither welcomed nor wanted by any realm beyond the mortal world. This is not merely punishment, it is a negation of existence itself, an erasure from the very structure of the cosmos that condemned them to wander in the spaces between. The souls that became the Sluagh were, during their earthly lives, profoundly wicked. But we must understand this wickedness not through modern moral frameworks, but through the lens of medieval Celtic Christianity and pre-Christian Celtic ethics. These were individuals whose transgressions were so grievous, so beyond redemption, that they corrupted something fundamental within themselves. They were not simply murderers or thieves. They were beings whose actions demonstrated a deliberate, knowing rejection of every moral code, every spiritual law, and every principle that bound communities together. They were oath-breakers of the most severe kind, individuals who violated the sacred bonds that held Celtic society intact. They were those who murdered guests under their own roofs, betrayed kinship bonds, practiced forms of cruelty that demonstrated an inhuman capacity for suffering infliction, and committed acts of sacrilege against the sacred places and rituals that protected the community. When such individuals died, the consequences were immediate and absolute. Their souls, corrupted beyond measure, ascended or descended through the pathways between worlds seeking their appointed destination. But heaven's gates closed before them. The divine realm, recognizing the absolute corruption that animated them, refused entry. These souls were too damaged, too fundamentally broken, to ever be rehabilitated or find peace in paradise. They could not be saved. They could not be redeemed. They could not be transformed into something approaching the divine. Simultaneously, hell itself rejected them. This is perhaps the most crucial and disturbing element of the Sluagh legend, that even damnation has limits. Even hell has standards. And even the infernal realm will not accept certain souls into its domain. The traditional interpretation suggests that hell recognized in the Sluagh a threat to its own order, a chaos and hunger so unbounded that accepting them would destabilize the entire structure of the infernal hierarchy. Cast out by both realms, these rejected souls found themselves in an impossible state of existence. They were not permitted to rest in peace, nor were they allowed to suffer in the ordered torment of damnation. They were not granted the mercy of non-existence, nor the satisfaction of having a purpose or place within any cosmological system. Instead, they were forced into a liminal state, caught perpetually between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, existing in the thin spaces where reality becomes uncertain and the laws of physics grow negotiable. This forced perpetuation became their prison, and the desperation of their condition became their defining characteristic. The Sluagh were not merely spirits haunting the landscape. They were beings actively suffering from a hunger so profound that it shaped every moment of their eternal existence. Understanding what the Sluagh hunger for is essential to comprehending their nature and their relentless behavior. They do not hunger for food or drink, for these material things hold no meaning for disembodied spirits. They do not hunger for revenge or the suffering of the living, as these motivations would eventually find completion or satisfaction. Their hunger is infinitely more fundamental and infinitely more terrible. They hunger for completion, for wholeness, for the possibility of closure that death should have granted them, but did not. They hunger for souls because they believe, or perhaps they truly know through some supernatural understanding, that consuming a human soul at the moment of death might allow them to achieve the transition they were denied. A fresh soul, still warm with life and possibility, passing through their spectral forms, might grant them access to a destination, might finally allow them to cross the threshold that both heaven and hell have sealed against them. This hunger is not a choice or a preference. It is an absolute compulsion wired into the very essence of what they have become. The Sluagh cannot choose to ignore a dying soul any more than a living person can choose to stop breathing. The presence of a human at the threshold of death triggers in them an irresistible drive, a pull more powerful than reason or restraint. They sense death approaching from extraordinary distances, drawn by something preternatural in their perceptions. Some traditions suggest they can smell the moment when a body begins to fail, when the spirit starts its departure. Others describe a kind of supernatural sixth sense that allows them to perceive the weakening of the bonds that attach a soul to the living world. Whatever the mechanism, the result is always identical. They come, they gather, they circle. They wait for the precise moment when the soul leaves the body, knowing that this instant of vulnerability is their only opportunity. The existence of the Sluagh, then, represents a complete breakdown of cosmic order, not through intentional rebellion or supernatural conquest, but through the simple fact of their own damned nature. They are beings whose very existence creates problems that the afterlife cannot solve. They are spirits, driven by a hunger that can never be satisfied, compelled toward acts that violate the natural order of death and the passage between worlds. They are neither subject to the authority of heaven nor subject to the authority of hell, existing in a state of absolute freedom and absolute constraint simultaneously. For the living populations of Ireland and Scotland, this meant that the Sluagh represented an entirely unique category of supernatural threat, one that could not be exorcised through prayer alone, could not be bargained with through spiritual negotiation, and could not be trusted to follow any rules or boundaries that governed other entities from the other world. If you were to encounter the Sluagh, your first impression would not be of individual creatures, but of a phenomenon, a disturbance in the fabric of reality itself, a tearing in the veil that separates the visible from the invisible. They do not arrive as sudden apparitions or supernatural manifestations that announce themselves through drama or spectacle. Instead, they come as something far more subtle and infinitely more disturbing. They arrive as an absence, as a gathering darkness that seems to swallow light itself. Those who have witnessed the Sluagh across centuries of oral tradition describe them not as discrete entities with clear forms, but as a collective entity, a swirling mass of dark shapes that move with terrible purpose through the night sky, a living shadow that possesses both presence and hunger. The Sluagh appear as a flock, and this collective nature is essential to understanding their supernatural power and their psychological impact on those who observe them. They are never solitary. They are always multitudinous, always numerous beyond accurate counting. Descriptions from Irish folklore speak of hundreds, sometimes thousands of dark forms moving together in synchronized chaos, their movements fluid and coordinated, yet somehow fundamentally wrong, moving in patterns that seem to violate the natural physics of flight. They are compared to a swarm of locusts, yet darker and more ethereal, or to a violent murmuration of starlings transformed by some horrible magic into something utterly malevolent. The collective movement creates an almost hypnotic effect, a rhythmic undulation of shadow that draws the eye and fills the observer with an inexplicable dread, as though witnessing something that the human mind was not designed to process. Each individual component of the Sluagh host appears as a winged shadow, a dark form with vague features that seem to shift and reform depending on the angle of observation and the quality of light available. The wings are described as leathery and expansive, resembling those of bats or enormous crows, yet with a texture that seems neither quite solid nor entirely transparent. These wings beat with a peculiar silence that witnesses found even more terrifying than noise would have been. The absence of sound creates an unnatural quality that penetrates the consciousness more deeply than any shriek or wail could achieve. Where normal birds announce their presence through the rush of air and the rhythm of wing beats, the Sluagh glide through the darkness almost as if the air itself parted for them without resistance, as though they flew through a medium different from the atmosphere that governs the living. The forms themselves resist clear description, and this opacity is itself a core element of their terrifying power. Witnesses consistently report that trying to focus directly on the details of a single Sluagh member causes the features to blur and shift, as though the entity deliberately resists human perception and understanding. The general impression is of something vaguely humanoid, with suggestions of faces, of arms, of a basic body structure, yet twisted and corrupted into something fundamentally inhuman. The faces, when visible at all, are described as gaunt and hollow-eyed, with mouths open in what might be hunger or might be an eternal scream. Some accounts describe elongated fingers resembling talons, while others speak of appendages that seem to shift between multiple configurations. This instability of form is profoundly disorienting to human observers, triggering a deep psychological revulsion rooted in the uncanny. The recognition that these beings are not quite natural, not quite following the rules that govern earthly existence. The coloration of the Sluagh is uniformly described across diverse geographical regions and historical time periods as profoundly dark. Not merely the darkness of night or shadow, but a darkness that seems to possess a quality entirely its own. They are compared to charcoal, to burnt wood, to the depths of a moonless night. Yet all these descriptions fail to capture the precise quality that witnesses found so disturbing. This darkness seems to actively absorb light, rather than merely reflect its absence. It has been described as a darkness that moves, that has agency, that possesses intention. Some witnesses from Irish tradition spoke of the Sluagh as being so profoundly dark that they seemed to create an absence around them, a zone of dimness or shadow that expanded and contracted as they flew, as though they carried with them a portable void. The Sluagh travel in formation, moving across the landscape with the precision of a supernatural military force executing a tactical operation. They flow across the land in waves and patterns, their collective mass undulating through the night sky with a terrible grace. They move as though drawn by an invisible thread, all turning in unison, all shifting direction with synchronized immediacy that no living flock of birds could achieve. The sound of their passage, when sound is detected at all, is described as a rustling, the soft, persistent whisper of feathers or wings moving through air, combined with something that witnesses found harder to articulate, a sound like distant screaming, barely perceptible, almost at the threshold of hearing. This auditory quality created a profound psychological disturbance in those who encountered it, triggering an instinctive recognition of danger and wrongness. What makes the vision of the Sluagh so deeply unsettling is not any single feature or characteristic, but rather the totality of the experience, the cumulative weight of wrongness that accumulates when observing a mass of entities that seem to violate fundamental principles of reality. They move through space in ways that seem to defy conventional physics. They exist in states that seem to occupy the boundary between presence and absence. They respond to stimuli that the living cannot perceive, orienting themselves toward the dying with supernatural precision and purpose. To witness the Sluagh is to experience a confrontation with something that challenges the observer's understanding of what is possible, what is real, and what boundaries separate the world of the living from the realms beyond death. There exists within the mythology of the Sluagh a detail so consistent, so universal across Irish and Scottish tradition, that its significance cannot be dismissed or overlooked. The Sluagh always come from the West. This is not a random characteristic or an arbitrary detail added to the legend for atmospheric enhancement. The perpetual westerly direction of the Sluagh's approach is woven into the very fabric of the mythology, mentioned in virtually every documented account, preserved across centuries of oral tradition with remarkable consistency. To understand why the damned eternally approach from the West is to unlock a fundamental truth about how the Celtic peoples understood death, the structure of the otherworld, and the relationship between the living realm and the spiritual dimensions that surrounded and interpenetrated it. This directional obsession reveals the profound sophistication of Celtic cosmological thinking and the symbolic systems that structured their entire spiritual worldview. In pre-Christian Celtic cosmology, the West held a significance that was simultaneously spiritual, temporal, and ontological. The West was not merely a direction on a compass. It was a threshold, a boundary, a liminal space where multiple realities intersected. As the sun descended into the western horizon each evening, it symbolized the transition from day to night, from wakefulness to sleep, from the conscious world to the realm of dreams and shadows. This daily occurrence created a powerful metaphorical framework. The West became associated with endings, with transitions, with the movement toward darkness and the unknown. For a people whose survival depended on seasonal rhythms and who lived in a climate where winter meant real scarcity and genuine danger, the symbolism of the setting sun was not abstract or purely poetic. It carried existential weight and meaning. The West was where light went to die each day. And in Celtic imagination, this was directly connected to where souls went when they departed from life. The otherworld in Celtic tradition was not located in the sky or beneath the earth in the manner of many other mythological systems. Instead, it existed in a spatial relationship to the mortal world that was fundamentally ambiguous and difficult to articulate through conventional geography. It was simultaneously present and absent, accessible yet hidden, permeating the same physical space as the visible world, while operating according to entirely different principles. However, if the otherworld had a direction in relation to the mortal realm, that direction was almost universally westward. Ancient Celtic texts speak of the blessed islands located to the west, beyond the reach of mortals, where time moves differently and suffering does not exist. These islands were sometimes called Tir na Nog or Mag Mell, and they represented the idealized realm where the blessed dead found eternal peace. The West, then, became the direction of transition, the pathway by which the dead were expected to travel toward their final destination in the otherworld. But here is where the mythology becomes more complex and more disturbing. The Sluagh come from the West, yet they are not traveling toward the otherworld. They are fleeing it. They are beings who were rejected by the otherworld itself, cast out and refused admission to even the infernal or neutral regions within it. Some interpretations of the myth suggest that the Sluagh were physically expelled from the Western realms, driven back toward the living world as a form of punishment or rejection. They were denied the peace of the blessed islands, denied the structured torment of infernal regions, and forced to retrace their steps toward the mortal realm, where they desperately hunt for a soul that might somehow grant them the access they were denied. In this interpretation, their westerly approach is not a journey toward home, but a desperate escape from rejection, a hunting expedition undertaken by the permanently excluded. The seasonal quality of the West also connects profoundly to the Celtic understanding of Samhain, the festival marking the boundary between summer and winter. During Samhain, the entire spiritual calendar shifted toward the west, and the darkness associated with winter and death. This was the period when the boundaries between worlds grew most permeable, when the Sluagh's power reached its zenith, and when the approach from the west became not merely possible, but inevitable. The connection between the setting sun, the dying year, the approach of winter, and the westerly direction of death created a comprehensive symbolic system that reinforced and legitimized the mythology of the Sluagh. The people understood intuitively that there was a pattern to when and from where these entities would approach, and this pattern was woven into the natural cycles of time itself. From a geographical perspective, the West held practical significance for Irish and Scottish populations. The western coasts were where civilization ended and the unknown began. Beyond the western horizon lay the Atlantic Ocean, an entity that ancient peoples regarded with both reverence and terror. The sea was the ultimate boundary, the final frontier, the place where the visible world gave way to uncertainty and vastness. For peoples living on western coastlines, the sea was simultaneously a source of sustenance and a constant threat. A realm where humans could not survive and where entirely different laws of physics and biology seemed to apply. In cultural imagination, the sea merged with the concept of the otherworld. Both were places of transformation, of mystery, and of danger. The Sluagh, approaching from the west, were in a sense approaching from beyond the sea, from the realm beyond the last boundary of the known world. The symbolic weight of the West is further enriched by understanding how Christian theology merged with pre-Christian Celtic concepts in Irish spiritual tradition. In medieval Christianity, the West came to represent the direction of hell itself, the place where demons and damned souls were believed to dwell. This Christian interpretation built upon and reinforced existing Celtic associations between the West and death or spiritual danger. The Sluagh, as beings rejected by both the heaven and hell, would naturally originate from this direction, not as blessed souls heading toward peace, but as tormented entities fleeing rejection and driven by hunger back toward the world of the living. The direction of their approach thus became a statement about their nature and their fate. They were beings moving against the proper flow of death, traveling in the opposite direction from where souls were supposed to journey. The primary obsession of the Sluagh, the singular purpose that drives their eternal wandering and animates their existence, is the hunt for human souls at the precise moment of death. This is not a secondary characteristic or a behavior they engage in occasionally when circumstances permit. The hunt for dying souls is the fundamental reason the Sluagh exist at all, the organizing principle of their entire being, and the mechanism through which they desperately pursue the only goal that might save them from their condemned state. To understand the Sluagh fully, you must grasp the terror of their hunt and the specificity of what they seek. They do not desire to harm the living indiscriminately or to torment the innocent. They do not seek to feed on blood or to consume flesh. What they hunt is something far more precious and far more difficult to defend against: the human soul at the exact moment when it separates from the body and begins its journey toward judgment or peace. The mechanics of this hunt operate according to rules so precise that they approach a kind of supernatural physics. The Sluagh possess an ability to perceive the approach of death with extraordinary accuracy and sensitivity. When a human being lies on their deathbed, when the body begins its final descent into cessation, when the spirit prepares to make its transition from the physical world to whatever realm awaits beyond, the Sluagh sense this occurrence. The nature of this perception remains mysterious and difficult to articulate, yet the consistency of descriptions across centuries suggests it is something far more acute than mere observation. Some traditions speak of the Sluagh smelling death approaching, detecting it through some supernatural olfactory sense that operates across distances normal perception could never accomplish. Others describe it as a kind of supernatural magnetism or attraction, an irresistible pull that draws them toward the dying, regardless of where they might be located or what other pursuits might occupy them. The distance at which the Sluagh can perceive approaching death seems to be enormous, extending far beyond the reach of ordinary sensory experience. Documented accounts from Irish traditions speak of families who moved dying relatives to remote locations specifically to prevent the Sluagh from finding them. Yet the host would still arrive, drawn by some perception of mortality that transcended physical distance or geographical isolation. This suggests that the Sluagh operate according to a fundamentally different relationship with space than living creatures do. They do not move through space in the manner of birds or other flying entities. They seem to traverse it almost instantaneously, following an invisible thread of supernatural attraction that connects them directly to the dying. Once the Sluagh perceive a soul approaching death, they begin their movement toward it with absolute determination and unwavering purpose. When the Sluagh arrive at the location where death is imminent, they do not immediately attack or display dramatic supernatural manifestations. Instead, they settle into a pattern of terrible waiting, circling the dwelling where the dying person rests, gathering in the darkness outside, hovering near windows and doorways as though searching for the most advantageous point of entry or observation. Witnesses describe the presence of the Sluagh as creating an overwhelming psychological pressure, a sense of being watched, of malevolent attention focused with absolute intensity on a single location. Family members keeping vigil with the dying reported feelings of oppressive dread, sudden cold spots despite the presence of fires, and the distinct sensation of being observed by multiple invisible presences. The house itself seemed to become a zone of supernatural conflict, a space where the normal rules of reality grew uncertain, and the boundary between the visible and invisible world became terrifyingly thin. The crucial moment arrives when the spirit begins to depart from the body. This is not a gradual process or a slow transition, but rather a distinct moment when something fundamental shifts in the dying person's nature. The breath becomes irregular and increasingly shallow. The eyes lose their focus. The body convulses or releases tension in a final, irreversible way. In this moment, when the soul begins its passage from the physical body into whatever realm awaits beyond death, the Sluagh strike. They do not attempt to enter the house or to physically confront those keeping vigil. Instead, they focus their supernatural hunger on the departing soul itself, attempting to intercept it at the exact instant it leaves the body. The soul, in its moment of vulnerability and transition, becomes the target of their desperate assault. This is the culmination of their eternal hunt, the moment toward which they have been driving with singular purpose. What happens if the Sluagh successfully capture a departing soul remains largely undefined in the traditions, deliberately ambiguous in a way that made the threat more psychologically terrifying. Some accounts suggest that the captured soul becomes trapped in the host, joining the ranks of the damned, and adding its hunger to the collective desperation of the Sluagh. Other traditions propose that the soul is consumed or devoured, that the Sluagh somehow absorb the vital essence of the dying individual and attempt to use this fresh spiritual energy to purchase their own passage into whatever comes after death. The lack of certainty about the precise fate of captured souls only intensified the terror felt by medieval and Irish and Scottish populations. Not knowing precisely what would happen to a loved one's soul if the Sluagh succeeded in their hunt made the threat more visceral and more immediate than any precisely defined danger could have been. The Irish historical record preserves numerous oral accounts of families who believed they had witnessed the Sluagh's hunting behaviour. Parish records from the 16th and 17th centuries contain testimonies from witnesses who described seeing dark shapes gathering around homes where death was occurring. These accounts, though recorded in the formal language of official documentation, convey a consistency of experience and observation that transcends mere superstition. Multiple witnesses across different regions reported similar phenomena: the sense of invisible presence, the extreme cold, the psychological oppression, the feeling that something was being fought over during the moment of death itself. These accounts were not treated as mere folklore by the church authorities who recorded them, but rather as genuine spiritual phenomena worthy of documentation and serious consideration. The widespread nature of these reports suggests that whatever the Sluagh might represent, whether interpreted as psychological projection, as genuine supernatural manifestation, or as something existing in the ambiguous space between, the phenomenon was real enough to leave profound impressions on the consciousness of those who experienced it. In the face of the Sluagh's relentless hunt, the people of Ireland and Scotland developed a protective ritual so widespread, so deeply embedded in the fabric of their deathbed customs, that it persisted across centuries and transcended numerous social upheavals and religious transformations. This ritual was deceptively simple in its execution, yet profound in its implications. When a person lay dying, when the final hours or minutes of life approached, the family would systematically close every window in the house that faced the western direction. This was not a random superstition born from misunderstanding or ignorance. This was a deliberate, purposeful act based on a sophisticated understanding of supernatural topology and a desperate attempt to create a barrier between the departing soul and the entities that hunted it from the Western realms. To close the Western window was to make a statement about the nature of reality itself, to attempt a negotiation with forces that operated according to rules fundamentally different from those governing the visible world. The logic underlying this protective measure was rooted in the cosmological beliefs we explored earlier regarding the directional nature of the Sluagh. If the damned host approached eternally from the west, if they travelled through space along invisible pathways connected to the western direction, then preventing their access through that direction seemed to offer at least the possibility of defence. The western window represented a literal and metaphorical gateway through which the Sluagh might attempt to reach the departing soul. By closing this window and securing it, families believed they were sealing off one crucial avenue of supernatural attack. This protective action was often accompanied by other defensive measures: the placement of iron objects near the dying person, the recitation of prayers and Christian blessings, the burning of sacred herbs or candles, and the constant presence of family members and sometimes priests or local spiritual leaders. The act of closing the western window was not performed casually or without ceremony. It was undertaken with full awareness of its significance and with a kind of ritualistic solemnity that reflected the gravity of the moment. As death approached, family members would ensure that all shutters or covers facing west were secured firmly, checking and rechecking to ensure absolute closure. In some regions, specific individuals were designated to perform this task, often the eldest family member or the person most skilled in spiritual matters. In other traditions, the closure of western windows was accompanied by specific verbal formulas or prayers, statements that articulated the family's intention to protect the dying soul and to deny the Sluagh access to their loved one. The ritualistic nature of the practice transformed it from a mere physical action into a spiritual declaration, a statement about the family's resistance to supernatural predation and their determination to fight for the soul of the dying. Historical documentation from Irish parishes and monastic communities provides extensive evidence of this practice. Records from the 17th and 18th centuries contain numerous references to families inquiring of priests whether closing western windows would provide genuine spiritual protection or whether additional measures would be necessary. Priests sometimes incorporated this practice into their deathbed ministry, blessing the closed windows and reinforcing the family's protective intentions with the authority of the Church. This institutional acceptance of the Western window practice by organized Christianity is significant because it demonstrates how ancient pre-Christian beliefs were not simply obliterated by Christian conversion, but rather absorbed and integrated into new religious frameworks. The Sluagh remained real and dangerous in the Christian imagination. The Western window closure remained a valid protective measure even within formerly Christian contexts. What is particularly revealing about this practice is what it suggests about the Sluagh's supernatural abilities and limitations. If the Western window offered genuine protection, this implies that the Sluagh could not simply pass through physical barriers or exist in locations sealed against them. They were constrained by certain rules and limitations, bound by some form of supernatural law that governed their ability to move through space and interact with the physical world. They could not bypass a sealed window through mere force or will. They could not manifest in locations that had been properly protected and secured. This suggests a conception of the Sluagh as powerful but not omnipotent, dangerous but not unstoppable. They operate according to rules that humans could theoretically understand and work within. This belief was psychologically crucial for populations facing the terror of supernatural predation. The knowledge that defenses existed, that the threat was bounded by certain limitations, made the terror more manageable, even if never entirely dispelled. The practice of closing Western windows created what might be understood as a supernatural quarantine zone. The sealed dwelling became a space where the Sluagh's hunting power was significantly diminished or rendered completely ineffective. However, this protection was understood to be incomplete or temporary. While the western window was sealed, the Sluagh's hunger remained active. Their presence still felt hovering outside the protected space. Some traditions suggest that sealed windows did not prevent the Sluagh from hovering near the dwelling or from attempting alternative forms of supernatural infiltration. The protection was sufficient to prevent direct assault through the obvious gateway, but the threat remained ever present, requiring constant vigilance and reinforced defenses throughout the dying process. The ritual of closing the western window also served important psychological functions for the living. In the face of death, an event that humans cannot ultimately prevent or control, the practice of taking deliberate protective action provided a sense of agency and purpose. Family members performing this ritual were not simply accepting death passively. They were actively engaging in spiritual combat, taking measures to protect their loved one's soul even as the body failed. This ritualistic response to death offered a framework for channeling grief and fear into purposeful action. The closed window became a symbol of family unity, of collective resistance against supernatural threats, and of the community's commitment to ensuring that the dying person's transition to the afterlife occurred with dignity and protection. In this sense, the Western window protection ritual functioned not merely as a physical or supernatural barrier, but as a deeply human response to the existential crisis that death represents. There exists a night on the Celtic calendar when the world as the living understand it becomes fundamentally unstable, when the boundaries between realms grow so dangerously permeable that the rules governing existence itself seem to unravel and reform according to alien principles. This night is Samhain, known in the Christian calendar as All Hallows' Eve or the night before All Saints' Day, and it represents the most dangerous and significant threshold in the entire year for those who dwell in the lands of Ireland and Scotland. It is during Samhain that the Sluagh's power reaches its absolute zenith, that their hunt becomes most frantic and most deadly, and that the protective measures ordinarily relied upon by the living prove dangerously insufficient. To understand the terror inspired by the Sluagh requires comprehending Samhain, the night when the host's hunger becomes almost unbearable, and when the veil separating the worlds becomes as thin as ancient parchment stretched across a frame. Samhain, occurring on the night of October 31st, marked the transition between the harvest season and the onset of winter in Celtic tradition. But this was far more than a simple seasonal marker or a calendar notation. Samhain represented a fundamental rupture in the temporal structure of existence itself. In Celtic cosmology, the year was divided into two primary seasons, the light half and the dark half. The light half, from Beltane in spring to Samhain in autumn, represented growth, plenty, warmth, and the manifestation of life energy throughout the visible world. The dark half, from Samhain to Beltane, represented dormancy, scarcity, cold, and the withdrawal of vital forces into hidden and invisible realms. Samhain was the pivot point, the moment when the world literally turned from light to darkness. On this night, the protective boundaries that ordinarily separated the light half from the dark half temporarily dissolved, leaving a window, brief but profound, when forces from the dark half could penetrate directly into the world of the living. During this liminal night, the normal rules governing the other world and the mortal realm became negotiable and uncertain. Beings that ordinarily could not manifest in the visible world found themselves capable of appearing in corporal or semi-corporal form. Spirits that were normally confined to specific locations or dimensions could move freely through the landscape. The dead, held at a distance by the protective structures of reality during the rest of the year, suddenly gained the ability to return to the homes they had occupied in life and to interact in limited ways with the living. This was not simply a single night of uncontrolled chaos. It was a night of structured, if frightening, supernatural possibility. The ancient peoples understood that Samhain followed certain rules and patterns, that the manifestations would follow recognizable pathways, and that knowledge of these patterns could provide some measure of defense against the flood of supernatural activity that accompanied the threshold night. For the Sluagh specifically, Samhain represented the culmination of their eternal desperation. Throughout the rest of the year, the boundaries of reality constrained them, limited their ability to hunt, and required them to work within narrow parameters of supernatural law. But on Samhain, these constraints loosened dramatically. The Sluagh's perceptions became even more acute, their ability to perceive dying souls extending across greater distances and with intensified clarity. Their ability to manifest in the physical world grew stronger, making them capable of effects and actions that remained impossible during the rest of the year. The constant hunger that animated them reached a fever pitch on this single night, driving them toward a hunting frenzy of almost incomprehensible intensity. Samhain was the Sluagh's season of greatest power, the night when their nature came closest to overwhelming the world of the living entirely. The folklore of Ireland and Scotland is saturated with accounts of Samhain nights when the Sluagh's hunting behaviour reached catastrophic levels. Stories describe homes surrounded by impossibly vast hosts of the damned, entire villages where multiple deaths occurred simultaneously, as the Sluagh's hunger overwhelmed all defensive measures and protective rituals. These accounts, preserved in oral tradition and occasionally committed to written records by ecclesiastical authorities, convey a sense of Samhain as a night of genuine danger, not merely a night for costumes and theatrical celebration, but a night when the dead genuinely threatened the living, and when the boundary between worlds became a site of genuine spiritual conflict. The western window, ordinarily an effective defense, proved inadequate on Samhain. The prayers and blessings that normally provided protection lost much of their power. The iron objects that typically repelled supernatural entities became less effective. On Samhain, families had to employ extraordinary measures, remaining awake throughout the night in constant vigilance, employing spiritual specialists or priests, lighting fires specifically designed to deter supernatural entities, and sometimes even abandoning homes and gathering in communal spaces where collective human presence might provide greater protection. The timing of Samhain is crucial to understanding both the historical context of these beliefs and their psychological impact on Celtic populations. Samhain occurred as the world was literally entering its darkest season, as the daylight hours were rapidly diminishing, as the temperature dropped, and as the landscapes of Ireland and Scotland were becoming increasingly barren and hostile to human habitation. The natural world was dying. The sun was dying. The year itself was entering its terminal phase. In this context of natural decline and increasing hardship, the belief that supernatural threats would simultaneously increase created a comprehensive framework of anxiety that aligned with observable environmental conditions. The dead would be most active when the world itself seemed most dead. The Sluagh would hunt most desperately when the living world was most diminished and vulnerable. The boundary between worlds would become most permeable precisely when human beings felt most isolated and most in need of comfort or protection. From a practical perspective, Samhain presented real survival challenges for ancient Celtic communities. The transition into winter required careful preparation, the storage of adequate food reserves, and the consolidation of communities for mutual protection and resource sharing. A harvest failure or an unexpected death during the critical transition into Samhain could have catastrophic consequences for entire groups. The mythology of the Sluagh at Samhain thus encoded genuine survival anxieties into supernatural narrative. The fear of the Sluagh's hunting frenzy on Samhain expressed the community's real fear of death, scarcity, and the unknown dangers of the coming winter. The ritual preparations undertaken to defend against the host, the gathering of communities, the lighting of protective fires, the vigilance and prayer were simultaneously practical survival strategies and spiritual defense against supernatural predation. The Sluagh and Samhain thus became part of a complete cultural system for managing the existential crisis represented by the annual transition into winter. The mythology of the Sluagh does not exist solely in the abstract realm of folklore and legend. Throughout the centuries, especially during periods of intensive documentation by religious authorities and folklore collectors, numerous specific accounts of Sluagh encounters were preserved in written form. These testimonies, recorded in parish registers, monastic chronicles, and later collected by organisations dedicated to preserving Irish and Scottish cultural heritage, provide a crucial bridge between the timeless aspects of the myth and the actual experiences reported by those who claim to have witnessed the host. While skepticism is certainly warranted when approaching historical supernatural testimony, the consistency of these accounts across different regions, time periods, and social classes suggests that something genuine lay behind the reports, whether interpreted as actual supernatural manifestation, as psychological phenomena, or as a cultural language for expressing real experiences of loss and terror. One particularly detailed account comes from 17th century Irish parish records and involves a family from County Galway, whose elderly father lay dying of illness during the winter months preceding Samhain. According to the testimony recorded by the local priest, the family had taken all standard precautions. The western windows had been sealed, iron objects had been placed around the dying man's bed, and the priest himself had blessed the dwelling and recited protective prayers throughout the evening. As the father's condition deteriorated toward midnight, multiple family members and servants reported experiencing simultaneous phenomena. A sudden, extreme cold that penetrated the house despite roaring fires, an overwhelming sense of dread and oppression that made breathing difficult, and most significantly, the perception of shapes moving outside the windows, despite the darkness. Those gathered claimed they heard sounds like wings beating against the walls, along with voices, not speaking words, but producing sounds that conveyed hunger and desperation in a manner that transcended language. The elderly man died as dawn approached, and the family maintained that they had witnessed a supernatural struggle for his soul throughout the final hours of his life. Another significant documented account derives from Scottish Highland tradition and appears in multiple variants throughout folklore collections from the 19th century. This account describes a young woman from the Hebridean Islands who became seriously ill during the approach to Samhain. Local tradition holds that the woman's illness was not natural, but rather represented an attack by supernatural forces. The woman herself reported experiencing visions and sensations of overwhelming hunger pressing against her consciousness, as though something outside the normal boundaries of her body was attempting to draw her away from life itself. Family members kept constant vigil, and several witnesses testified to perceiving dark shapes gathering around the cottage where she lay ill. Unlike the Galway account, this case resulted in the woman's recovery, attributed by the community to the effective protection measures undertaken by her family and the intervention of a local spiritual specialist who was known for her ability to combat supernatural threats. This account is particularly significant because it suggests that the Sluagh's hunt could sometimes be resisted and deflected, that with sufficient preparation and spiritual knowledge, a dying person's soul could potentially be defended against the host's assault. The records of the Irish Folklore Commission, formally established in 1930 and operating until 1971, contain hundreds of collected accounts from informants who had either witnessed the Sluagh directly or had heard detailed testimony from family members or community elders who had done so. These accounts, recorded from oral tradition by trained collectors and preserved in archives, demonstrate remarkable consistency in certain key details. Witnesses repeatedly describe the dark colour of the entities, their collective nature, the sensation of overwhelming wrongness and dread that accompanied their presence, and most crucially, their association with death occurring at or near the moment of their sighting. Multiple collectors noted that informants describing Sluagh encounters used strikingly similar language and reported remarkably parallel sequences of events, despite coming from different regions and having had no direct contact with one another. This consistency suggests either a genuine shared phenomenon that produced similar observable effects across diverse geographical areas, or alternatively, a deeply rooted cultural framework that structured the interpretation of ambiguous experiences into a recognized pattern. Particularly noteworthy are accounts that specifically involve Samhain encounters. One particularly detailed account was collected in 1938 from an elderly woman from County Kerry who described a Samhain night in her childhood when the Sluagh allegedly attacked her home with unusual ferocity. According to her testimony, the normal protective measures proved inadequate that particular night. The sealed windows and protective objects seemed to offer less defense than they ordinarily would. She reported hearing the sound of the host circling the dwelling with increasing intensity, the psychological pressure growing until family members felt nearly unable to function. The crisis passed when a travelling priest happened to arrive at the house and performed an extended blessing ceremony, during which the woman reported the perceived presence of the Sluagh retreating and eventually dissipating entirely. The specificity of this account, the failure of ordinary defences, the escalation through the night, and the role of priestly intervention mirrors details found in other documented accounts, suggesting either genuine, repeated phenomena or a consistent cultural narrative for interpreting supernatural crises. It is important to note that documented accounts of Sluagh encounters cluster heavily during specific historical periods. The 16th and 17th centuries produced extensive written documentation, particularly from ecclesiastical sources. The Folklore Commission's collection from the 20th century represents another period of intensive documentation, though by this time the accounts were being recorded from aged informants describing events they had heard about in childhood rather than directly witnessed. This temporal distribution suggests that the intense belief in the Sluagh may have been particularly strong during periods of genuine social crisis, disease, or spiritual uncertainty. The 17th century in Ireland was marked by religious upheaval, warfare, and real disease and mortality that would naturally intensify focus on supernatural explanations for death. The 20th century informants often spoke of their childhood experiences, placing their observations in the 19th century when traditional Irish culture was undergoing rapid transformation and transition. The accounts preserved in the Folklore Commission archives also reveal interesting variations in Sluagh manifestations, depending on geographical location and specific circumstances. Coastal communities reported encounters with forms that seemed partially aquatic or sea-related, as though the Sluagh's appearance was influenced by local environment and resources. Highland communities described hosts that seemed somehow connected to the harsh mountain landscape and the perpetual wind. Urban accounts from Dublin and other cities described encounters that seemed subtly different from rural manifestations, as though the Sluagh's nature adapted to the environments they haunted. These variations suggest either that the Sluagh genuinely exist and manifest differently in different contexts, or alternatively, that communities drew upon their specific environmental knowledge and fears to construct locally appropriate interpretations of the basic Sluagh archetype. Within the vast constellation of Celtic death mythology, the Sluagh do not exist in isolation. They share the landscape of the otherworld and the thin spaces between worlds with other entities whose relationship to death is complex, often terrifying, and sometimes barely comprehensible to those attempting to understand them through modern frameworks. Among these entities, one stands out with particular significance and particular resonance with the Sluagh, the Banshee, or Bean Seedhe, the woman of the fairy host. Both the Banshee and the Sluagh function as harbingers of death, as entities whose appearance signals the approach of mortality and whose primary relationship to human existence revolves around the moment when life transitions to non-existence. Yet while these two entities operate within the same mythological framework and often manifest during the same liminal circumstances, they serve fundamentally different roles in the Celtic understanding of death, mourning, and the passage between worlds. To understand the Sluagh fully requires placing them in relationship with the Banshee, recognizing both their similarities and their crucial differences. The Banshee appears in Celtic tradition as a female figure, often of indeterminate age, but invariably possessed of an otherworldly quality that marks her as fundamentally alien to human existence. She is described as beautiful in some accounts and hideous in others, as young and as ancient simultaneously, as existing in a state that transcends ordinary physical description. What distinguishes the Banshee most clearly is not her appearance, but her voice, the piercing, anguished wail through which she announces approaching death. This wail is not words or language in the conventional sense, but rather a pure expression of grief and lamentation so profound that it seems to pierce the fabric of reality itself. When a death is imminent in a family or community, the Banshee appears and begins her terrible keening, a sound that no living creature can produce and that no human hearing can endure unmoved. The Banshee's wail carries with it a weight of genuine mourning. She does not shriek in hunger or desperation, but rather sings a song of loss and inevitable transition, expressing a grief that transcends the death of any individual and touches something universal about the human condition. Where the Sluagh and the Banshee diverge most sharply is in their fundamental relationship to the dying person whose death they announce or pursue. The Banshee, despite her terrifying nature and her association with death, is not hostile to the dying individual. She does not hunt or assault the departing soul. She does not attempt to capture or consume it. Instead, she fulfills a role that might be understood as emotional witness and cosmic acknowledgement. Her wail announces to the community and to the universe itself that a significant death is occurring, that a transition is happening, that grief is appropriate and necessary. The Banshee's cry is a form of respect, an acknowledgement that the passing of a human soul matters, that the departure from life deserves recognition and mourning. She is, in essence, the voice of the community's collective grief given supernatural form and agency. The Sluagh, by contrast, represents pure hunger and malevolent purpose. They do not mourn, they hunt. They do not acknowledge, they assault. They do not seek to recognize the significance of a death. They seek to capture the very soul departing from life. The social and cultural significance of these two entities within Celtic tradition also differs dramatically. The Banshee's appearance, while terrifying, carries a certain dignity and inevitability. Her wail, though anguishing to hear, represents a supernatural acknowledgement that the dying person or family merits her attention, that their death is significant enough to draw the notice of powerful otherworldly entities. In some traditions, a family's importance is measured by whether they have their own personal Banshee, a specific entity attached to a particular lineage who announces the deaths of family members across generations. The presence of a Banshee thus carries implications of status and significance. The Sluagh, by contrast, represent pure predatory threat with no element of honor or recognition. Their hunt is motivated entirely by their own hunger and desperation, not by any concern for the significance of the individual dying. Sluagh do not distinguish between important and insignificant deaths. They pursue all dying souls with equal ferocity. The protective measures undertaken against these two entities also reveal fundamental differences in their nature and in human perception of their threat level. Defense against the banshee is essentially impossible. Her appearance cannot be prevented, and her wail cannot be stopped. However, hearing the banshee's cry is sometimes interpreted as a blessing, a sign that the death occurring is one that deserves supernatural recognition. Protection against the Sluagh, by contrast, focuses on active defense and barrier creation, the closing of windows, the placement of protective objects, the presence of spiritual specialists. This difference suggests that the banshee is understood as an inevitable part of the natural process of death, while the Sluagh represents an aberration or a threat that can potentially be resisted. Communities prepare for the banshee's appearance with resignation. They prepare against the Sluagh's attack with active resistance and hope of deflection. In terms of spiritual function and cosmic role, the banshee represents the feminine principle of mourning, witness, and the dignified acknowledgement of death's inevitability. She embodies the community's need to grieve, to express emotion in the face of loss, and to recognize transitions as significant moments worthy of supernatural attention. The Sluagh, by contrast, embodies terror, hunger, and the violation of natural death's peaceful conclusion. If the banshee represents what death should be, recognized, mourned, and accepted with dignity, then the Sluagh represent what death should not be: predatory, violent, and resulting in spiritual annihilation rather than peaceful transition. Together, these two entities frame the entire Celtic understanding of death as a space where both dignity and terror, both acceptance and violation, both peace and violence remain eternally possible. During Samhain especially, both the banshee and the Sluagh become more active and more powerful. Yet, even on the night when the boundaries between worlds grow most permeable, their purposes remain distinct. The banshee's wailing might intensify, her presence become more overwhelming, but her fundamental role remains unchanged. She mourns and announces. The Sluagh's hunting might reach fever pitch, their assault on the dying becoming nearly irresistible, but their nature also remains unchanged. They hunt and devour. For the living populations of Ireland and Scotland, the simultaneous presence of both entities on crucial nights created a cosmological drama of profound complexity. While the community gathered to defend against the Sluagh's assault on a dying person's soul, they might simultaneously hear the banshee's wail, acknowledging that death's approach was inevitable and deserving of genuine grief. These two entities, in their contradictory ways, express the full complexity of the human relationship with mortality itself. To understand why the Sluagh exist, why they occupy their unique and terrible position in the cosmological hierarchy, we must confront a difficult philosophical and spiritual question. What constitutes wickedness so profound that both heaven and hell reject it? This is not a question that medieval or ancient Celtic Christianity answered simply or without considerable theological complexity. The souls that became the Sluagh were not merely wicked in the manner of ordinary sinners. They were not murderers motivated by passion, thieves driven by desperation, or individuals who committed isolated transgressions against divine law. The wickedness embodied by the Sluagh represented something far more fundamental and far more corrupting. A deliberate, knowing, systematic rejection of every moral code and every spiritual law that held both the human community and the cosmic order together. To be wicked enough to become Sluagh was to commit a form of evil that transcended individual moral failure and approached a kind of ontological corruption, a transformation of the very soul into something fundamentally inimical to existence itself. In medieval Celtic Christian theology, which blended pre-Christian Celtic concepts with Christian doctrine in complex and sometimes contradictory ways, certain categories of sin were understood to be worse than others. Murder was grave, but murder committed against one's own kinfolk, particularly against a guest taking shelter under one's roof or against a family member, represented a violation so profound that it touched the sacred bonds that held human society together. The Celtic world operated according to a complex system of obligations and relationships structured around kinship, guest friendship, and sacred oath-taking. To violate these bonds was not merely to commit a crime, it was to tear at the very fabric that prevented human society from descending into chaos. The Brehon laws, the ancient legal codes of Ireland, recognized degrees of responsibility and prescribed different penalties for different classes of individuals committing the same act. A system that acknowledged the importance of relationships and social position in determining moral culpability. The souls that became the Sluagh had violated these sacred bonds repeatedly and deliberately, often with knowledge of the cosmic consequences their actions would trigger. Some accounts speak of individuals who were oath breakers on a massive scale, those who had sworn sacred oaths before druids or Christian priests and then deliberately violated them for personal gain. Breaking an oath was understood not merely as dishonesty, but as an attack on the very structure of reality itself, because oaths were believed to carry cosmic weight and binding power. When an oathbreaker died, they were understood to carry that violation with them into the afterlife, their corruption extending beyond their physical death and into the spiritual realms. Others among the Sluagh had been guilty of what might be understood as sacred sacrilege, desecration of holy places, violation of sacred rituals, or deliberate attacks on the spiritual practices that protected the community. Still, others had committed acts of cruelty so extreme and so devoid of mercy that they suggested an entire absence of human compassion or connection to the moral order. The concept of spiritual contamination was crucial to understanding the nature of the Sluagh's wickedness. In Celtic spirituality, both pre-Christian and Christian, certain actions or states were understood to create a kind of spiritual pollution or corruption that clung to the perpetrator and could not be easily washed away through ordinary repentance or ritual. A person guilty of certain categories of transgression carried a spiritual stain that marked them as fundamentally polluted and dangerous to the community. The Sluagh, in their ultimate corruption, represented individuals whose spiritual pollution had reached such extremes that they no longer belonged to any category of beings that the cosmos could accommodate. They were too corrupted for heaven to accept and rehabilitate. They were too unstable and too dangerous even for hell's hierarchy to integrate into its ordered structure. They had become something beyond the scope of the entire cosmic system that the afterlife represented. The rejection by hell represents a particularly intriguing element of the Sluagh mythology that deserves careful consideration. In Christian theology, hell exists as a place of punishment and torment for souls deemed worthy of damnation. One might reasonably assume that the most wicked souls would naturally find themselves consigned to hell's depths. Yet the Sluagh mythology suggests that even hell has limits and standards, that there exist categories of wickedness so extreme or so fundamentally problematic that even the infernal realm will not accept them. Some theological interpretations suggest that the Sluagh were rejected by hell because their nature is too chaotic, too hungry, and too fundamentally destructive to be integrated into even the ordered cruelty of damnation. Hell requires structure and hierarchy. The Sluagh represented pure chaos and hunger. To admit them to hell would be to introduce an element that would destabilize and corrupt hell's own structure. Thus, hell itself rejected them as a matter of cosmic self-preservation. Another interpretation focuses on the nature of the Sluagh's crime as being ultimately a crime against creation itself, rather than merely against God or against individual humans. Those who became the Sluagh had committed transgressions so profound that they represented attacks on the very fabric of existence. They had violated kinship, destroyed trust, desecrated the sacred, and in doing so, had attempted to unravel the bonds that held reality together. Such crimes might be understood as unforgivable, not because they were committed against a specific person or even against God directly, but because they constituted an attack on existence itself. For such offences, neither heaven's grace nor hell's punishment represented an appropriate response. They demanded something else entirely: rejection, exile, and forced existence in the liminal spaces where reality itself becomes uncertain. The psychological dimension of the Sluagh's wickedness should not be overlooked. The souls that became the Sluagh were not merely individuals who committed evil acts. They were beings who seemed to lack the fundamental capacity for moral reasoning or spiritual connection that bound the human community together. They operated without conscience, without compassion, and without any apparent recognition of the sacred bonds that connected humans to one another and to the divine. They represented, in essence, the possibility of human existence emptied of morality, compassion, and spiritual connection. For medieval Celtic people struggling to create and maintain moral communities in difficult circumstances, the Sluagh embodied the terror of encountering beings who had somehow transcended or rejected the moral framework entirely. They were not merely bad individuals, they were beings who demonstrated that existence without morality was possible, and this possibility itself was profoundly threatening to the entire social and spiritual order. Throughout the centuries of living with the knowledge that the Sluagh hunted for dying souls, the people of Ireland and Scotland developed an intricate system of protective measures and defensive practices designed to resist, deflect, or prevent the host's successful assault on the departing spirit. These were not superstitious rituals born from ignorance or desperation, but rather carefully refined techniques developed through generations of experience and spiritual knowledge. They represented a complete framework for managing supernatural threat through a combination of physical barriers, spiritual intervention, community participation, and the marshalling of both material and immaterial resources. To understand these protective measures is to recognize how the people of Celtic lands transformed their relationship with the Sluagh from one of absolute victimhood to one of active resistance and strategic defense. The fact that protection was possible, that the Sluagh could be resisted, their assault deflected, and the dying person's soul preserved, was psychologically crucial for populations living under the threat of supernatural predation. The western window closure that we examined earlier represented only one component of a much larger defensive system. While the ceiling of the Western approach was foundational, families understood that comprehensive protection required multiple layers of defense operating simultaneously on different spiritual and material levels. Iron objects held a particular significance in these protective practices, drawing on pre-Christian Celtic beliefs about iron's supernatural properties, while being reinforced by Christian tradition that similarly attributed protective qualities to this metal. Iron nails, iron tools, iron horseshoes, and iron implements of various kinds were placed around the dying person's bed, arranged deliberately to create a perimeter of protection that the Sluagh supposedly could not penetrate. Some traditions specified particular configurations for these iron objects, suggesting that their precise arrangement and positioning carried significance beyond mere symbolic value. The belief in iron's protective properties was so widespread and so deeply embedded that it transcended cultural and religious boundaries, persisting despite various attempts by Christian authorities to discourage belief in material protective objects in favor of spiritual faith alone. Salt water represented another crucial component of the defensive arsenal employed against the Sluagh. Bowls of salt water were placed at windows and doorways, with the belief that the salt represented a barrier that the supernatural entities could not cross. In some traditions, the entire perimeter of a house where someone lay dying would be marked with salt water, creating an invisible boundary intended to confine the Sluagh to the exterior spaces and prevent their penetration of the interior. The use of salt drew upon both pre-Christian traditions that associated salt with purification and protection, and Christian practices that employed salt in blessing and consecration rituals. The combination of salt and water was understood to possess particular potency, representing both the purifying qualities of salt and the sacred nature of water in Christian tradition. Some accounts describe families employing salt water not merely as a passive barrier, but as an active agent, with family members sprinkled with salt water or washing their hands and faces with salted water to create a zone of protection around their own bodies. Fire held a position of supreme importance in the protective practices surrounding the dying. Specific types of fires were lit and maintained throughout the night when death was expected, with these fires understood to serve multiple protective functions simultaneously. The flames themselves were believed to repel supernatural entities, or at least to limit their ability to manifest in close proximity to the fire's influence. The smoke from the flames, particularly when sacred herbs or specific types of wood were burned, was understood to create an invisible barrier against supernatural intrusion. Some traditions specified particular woods that should be burned: hawthorn, rowan, or other plants associated with protective properties in Celtic tradition. The heat and light of the fire also served practical functions, allowing family members to maintain vigilance throughout the night and to respond immediately to any signs of supernatural manifestation or changes in the dying person's condition. The presence of fire created a zone of safety and control, a space where human authority and knowledge could be applied against forces ordinarily beyond human capacity to influence. Spiritual specialists and religious authorities played crucial roles in the protective measures undertaken during deathbed vigils. These individuals, whether they were priests, monks, local healers known for supernatural knowledge, or individuals recognized in the community as possessing particular spiritual insight or power, were often called to the homes of dying people to provide additional layers of protection beyond what family members alone could accomplish. These specialists brought with them prayers, blessings, sacred objects, and ritual knowledge that was believed to carry genuine protective power. The presence of a priest performing Christian rites and blessings created a sacred space infused with divine authority, ostensibly making it impossible for the Sluagh to penetrate. Some accounts describe particularly skilled spiritual specialists employing elaborate ritual procedures designed specifically to counter the Sluagh's hunting behavior, speaking words of power, drawing symbols understood to have protective significance, or creating elaborate spiritual configurations intended to trap or repel the supernatural attackers. Community presence itself represented a crucial defensive measure that should not be underestimated in its significance. The dying person was never left alone. Instead, a constant vigil was maintained with family members, friends, community members, and sometimes the priest or other spiritual specialists remaining present throughout the night and the period immediately preceding death. This continuous human presence served multiple protective functions simultaneously. The psychological comfort of not being alone during the approach of death was significant, but the practical protective value was equally important. Multiple observers could perceive and respond to supernatural manifestations, and the collective human presence in the room was believed to create a barrier of human consciousness and will that the Sluagh found more difficult to penetrate. Some traditions suggest that the Sluagh preferred to hunt isolated dying individuals, and that the presence of multiple humans focused on resisting their assault substantially diminished their effectiveness. Prayer and verbal formulae represented the final crucial layer of defensive practice. Families would recite specific prayers, often mixing Christian and pre-Christian elements, throughout the dying process. These verbal formulations were understood not as mere psychological comfort, but as genuine spiritual weapons with real power against supernatural threats. Some traditions preserve specific prayers or chants understood to be particularly effective against the Sluagh, passed down through families across generations and performed at critical moments when death was imminent. The act of speaking, of articulating one's resistance and one's assertion of the dying person's right to peaceful passage, was understood to carry power in the spiritual realm. The combination of multiple family members speaking these protective formulas simultaneously created a unified field of human spiritual intention directed against the Sluagh's assault. While the fundamental characteristics of the Sluagh remained remarkably consistent across the Celtic lands, the myth did not manifest identically in every region where it took root. Instead, the legend adapted and evolved, shaped by local geography, climate, historical circumstances, and the particular spiritual traditions of different communities. The Sluagh of the Scottish Highlands presented a somewhat different character than the Sluagh of the Irish Midlands, and the entities described in coastal regions differed in subtle but significant ways from those haunting inland territories. These regional variations are not contradictions or inconsistencies within the mythology, but rather evidence of a living tradition that remained responsive to local context while maintaining core mythological principles across vast geographical areas. Understanding these regional differences reveals how the basic Sluagh archetype functioned as a flexible framework that communities could adapt to express their particular fears, their environmental challenges, and their specific spiritual concerns. In the Scottish Highlands, the Sluagh took on characteristics distinctly influenced by the harsh, mountainous terrain and the brutal climate that defined life in those regions. The Highland Sluagh were often described as being more violent and more aggressive than their Irish counterparts, as though the landscape itself had made them fiercer and more desperate. The constant wind that swept across Highland moorlands and mountains seemed to be incorporated into the mythology. Some accounts describe the Sluagh as riding on the wind, as being born from the wind, or as being inseparable from the wild air currents that made the Highlands so forbidding and dangerous. The connection between wind and the Sluagh was so strong in Highland tradition that families living in particularly windy locations undertook additional protective measures during death, understanding that the wind itself served as a pathway for the host's approach. The isolation of Highland communities, scattered across difficult terrain and often separated by geographical barriers that made travel hazardous, meant that each valley or glen developed its own specific variations on the Sluagh mythology, adapting the basic legend to fit local understanding and experience. The Scottish lowlands, by contrast, presented a different environmental context and thus developed somewhat different interpretations of the Sluagh phenomenon. In the more densely populated agricultural regions of the lowlands, where communities were larger and communication between distant settlements was more frequent, the Sluagh mythology incorporated elements influenced by more extensive contact with English culture and traditions. The lowland Sluagh was sometimes depicted as being less purely supernatural and more connected to historical events or specific episodes of violence and suffering. Some lowland traditions link the Sluagh to victims of historical conflicts or to souls of those who had died in particularly violent or traumatic circumstances. The proximity to England and the history of border conflicts meant that the lowland Sluagh sometimes acquired characteristics influenced by English supernatural traditions, creating hybrid entities that bore some similarities to both Celtic and Anglo-Saxon concepts of malevolent spirits. This cross-cultural influence demonstrates how folklore operates not in isolation, but within broader networks of cultural exchange and communication. In Ireland itself, regional variations were equally significant. The Irish coast, particularly the western and southwestern coasts, where the Atlantic Ocean stretched endlessly toward the horizon, generated specific variations on the Sluagh mythology that incorporated maritime imagery and oceanic characteristics. Coastal communities describe Sluagh that seem to emerge from or to be connected to the sea itself, entities that appeared as combinations of aerial and aquatic characteristics, forms that seem to swim through air as fish swim through water. In some coastal traditions, the Sluagh were understood to be particularly active during storms or periods of turbulent weather, when the barrier between the normal world and supernatural realms seemed to dissolve along with the normal patterns of wind and water. The Irish Midlands and inland regions, by contrast, produced traditions that emphasized the Sluagh's connection to the landscape itself, to forests, to lakes, to the ancient earthworks and sacred sites that marked the territory as a place of spiritual significance and danger. Island communities, particularly those in the Western Islands off the Irish coast, developed particularly intense and specific variations on the Sluagh mythology, perhaps because their isolation and geographical vulnerability made them especially susceptible to supernatural threats, or because their distinctive environment required adaptations of the basic legend to match local conditions. The urban versus rural divide also produced significant variations in how the Sluagh was understood and discussed. In rural areas where death remained an intimate community experience, and where deathbed vigils maintained ancient traditions with relatively little modification, the Sluagh mythology persisted with its traditional forms and associated protective practices largely intact. In urban centres, particularly in cities like Dublin, that experienced significant population growth and social transformation during the medieval and early modern periods, the Sluagh mythology underwent subtle transformations. Urban dwellers sometimes described the Sluagh as being less dramatically supernatural and more incorporated into religious and social frameworks, influenced by Christian orthodoxy and urban institutions. The role of the church in urban areas was more dominant and more comprehensive than in rural regions, which meant that Christian interpretations of the Sluagh sometimes superseded or substantially modified older pre-Christian understandings of the entity. The temporal evolution of regional variations is also significant. During the late medieval and early modern periods, as travel became more feasible and as written documentation of folklore began to occur more systematically, different regional variations of the Sluagh mythology began to influence each other. Travelers and traders moving between regions shared stories and accounts, and these were incorporated into local traditions, creating hybrid forms that blended elements from multiple regional sources. By the time systematic folklore collection began in the 20th century, many regional variations had been substantially influenced by exposure to other versions of the legend, making it difficult to determine what aspects of a given regional variation represented genuinely local development and what aspects represented the influence of other regional traditions, or the impact of modern storytelling and literary culture. Social class and education also influenced regional variations in Sluagh beliefs. Educated clerics and monks often had access to written theological texts that provided sophisticated frameworks for understanding supernatural entities, and their interpretations of the Sluagh sometimes differed from the beliefs held by rural populations or the urban poor. Aristocratic families and wealthy merchant communities sometimes maintained different variations of Sluagh mythology than peasant or working class populations in the same geographical regions. These class-based variations reflect how mythology functions not as a unified system, but as a collection of overlapping frameworks that different social groups adapted and modified according to their own needs, knowledge, and circumstances. Yet despite all these variations, regional, temporal, urban-rural, and class-based, the core elements of the Sluagh mythology remained remarkably resilient across the Celtic lands, suggesting that the legend addressed fundamental human concerns about death, judgment, and the consequences of wickedness in ways that transcended local particularities. The legend of the Sluagh did not emerge fully formed from a single historical moment or cultural event. Instead, it evolved gradually across centuries, shaped by pre-Christian Celtic spirituality, medieval Christian theology, historical events, and the gradual transformation of Irish and Scottish societies from isolated Celtic kingdoms through centuries of foreign conquest, religious upheaval, and social modernization. Tracing the Sluagh's evolution through history reveals not merely changes in how the entity was understood or described, but rather the ways in which a fundamental myth about death, judgment, and consequence remained relevant and meaningful, even as the cultural and religious contexts in which it existed underwent radical transformation. The persistence of the Sluagh legend across such vast temporal and cultural distances suggests that the myth addresses something fundamental about human consciousness and the human relationship with mortality, something that transcends any particular historical moment or cultural framework. In the pre-Christian Celtic world, the conceptual framework that would eventually crystallize into the Sluagh mythology already existed in fragmentary form. The pre-Christian Celts understood death not as a simple ending, but as a transition between states of existence. They believed in the existence of the other world, a realm existing alongside and interpenetrating the mortal world, and they recognized that certain souls might become trapped or lost in the spaces between worlds, rather than achieving peaceful transition to their final destination. The Celtic understanding of death incorporated sophisticated concepts about the consequences of one's actions in life and the possibility that certain categories of individuals might face different fates than others after death. The connection between a person's moral character and their destiny after death was already established in Celtic thought, though the specific form that this would take with the Sluagh, beings rejected by both heaven and hell, would only emerge later when Celtic spirituality encountered and merged with Christian theology. The Christianization of Ireland and Scotland, beginning in the 5th century and extending across subsequent centuries, fundamentally transformed how the Sluagh mythology was understood and articulated. Christian theology provided new frameworks for understanding damnation, judgment, and the structure of the afterlife that were incorporated into and modified existing Celtic concepts. The Christian concepts of heaven and hell, of divine judgment and eternal consequence, merged with pre-Christian Celtic beliefs about the otherworld and spiritual realms to create something unprecedented, a comprehensive cosmology that attempted to integrate both Christian and Celtic understandings of death and the afterlife. The Sluagh, in this merged system, became entities that represented the limits of both Christian and Celtic understanding, being so wicked that they exceeded the capacity of either system to accommodate them. The legend of the Sluagh thus embodies the actual historical process of religious and cultural synthesis that occurred as Christian Ireland emerged from pre-Christian Celtic foundation. During the medieval period, from approximately the 6th century through the 16th century, the Sluagh mythology became deeply embedded in Irish and Scottish Christian culture. Monastic communities, which served as centres of learning and cultural preservation, incorporated references to the Sluagh into their theological writings and into the sacred texts they copied and illuminated. Hagiographies of Irish and Scottish saints sometimes included references to encounters with supernatural entities, and in some cases, these encounters were explicitly identified as meetings with the Sluagh or similar damned hosts. The Sluagh mythology became part of the intellectual and spiritual framework through which educated Christian monks understood the spiritual landscape surrounding them. Yet simultaneously, the legend persisted in oral tradition among the general population, maintaining connections to pre-Christian concepts and practices, even as the intellectual framework surrounding it became increasingly Christianized. This dual existence of the Sluagh mythology in both scholarly Christian contexts and in popular oral tradition allowed it to persist and adapt across centuries of social change. The early modern period, from roughly the 16th century onward, witnessed significant documentation of the Sluagh mythology through various channels. As literacy expanded and as written records became more comprehensive, more accounts of Sluagh encounters and beliefs about the host were committed to permanent written form. Parish records, monastic chronicles, and eventually the systematic efforts of folklore collectors created an extensive documentary record of Sluagh beliefs and encounters. This written documentation is particularly valuable because it provides specific dates, names, and contextual details that allow us to trace how the mythology persisted and evolved through specific historical moments. The period also witnessed the Protestant Reformation and various religious conflicts that influenced how supernatural beliefs were discussed and understood, with some Protestant authorities attempting to suppress belief in the Sluagh, while others incorporated the legend into Reformed Christian frameworks. The colonial period and the subsequent transformation of Irish and Scottish societies through industrialization and modernization created new challenges for the persistence of traditional supernatural beliefs. As cities grew, as education expanded, and as scientific worldviews became increasingly dominant, belief in the Sluagh seemed to many observers to be declining toward complete extinction. Yet the legend proved remarkably resilient. Even as the social and religious contexts that had sustained the mythology underwent radical transformation, the Sluagh persisted in collective memory and in the oral traditions maintained by rural and working-class communities. The Irish Folklore Commission's systematic collection efforts in the 20th century revealed that despite decades of modernization and social change, the Sluagh mythology remained alive in the memories of aged informants who had heard about them in childhood, or who themselves believed in the host based on family tradition and community knowledge. The 20th century represents a crucial turning point in the Sluagh mythology's evolution. As systematic folklore collection occurred, and as accounts were preserved in archives, the legend underwent a transformation from living oral tradition to documented historical artifact. This transformation created a paradoxical situation. The Sluagh mythology became simultaneously more preserved and more removed from active living practice. Fewer people in the modern world actually believed in the Sluagh as a genuine supernatural threat, yet more detailed documentation of the mythology became available than ever before. Modern popular culture, including literature, film, and television, discovered the Sluagh mythology and began incorporating it into contemporary storytelling, further transforming and extending its reach. The legend, which had been primarily transmitted through family networks and oral tradition for centuries, began to be transmitted through mass media and academic study, reaching audiences far beyond the Celtic lands where the mythology had originated. In our contemporary world of electric lights, scientific medicine, and digital technology, one might reasonably expect the legend of the Sluagh to have faded into obscurity, a quaint artifact of a superstitious past preserved only by folklorists and antiquarians with specialized interest in historical beliefs. Yet the mythology persists, continues to capture imaginations and remains relevant even in contexts radically distant from the medieval Irish and Scottish worlds that originally generated the legend. The continued vitality of the Sluagh mythology in modern culture suggests that the legend addresses something fundamental about human consciousness that transcends historical moment or cultural context. Something about death, judgment, consequence, and the terror of existing outside any framework of meaning or belonging. Understanding why the Sluagh mythology remains psychologically and culturally significant in the modern world requires looking beyond mere historical interest and examining what psychological and existential concerns the legend continues to articulate for contemporary audiences. The Sluagh mythology has found new life in contemporary media and popular culture, appearing in novels, films, television series, and video games that introduce the legend to audiences who have no direct cultural or familial connection to Irish and Scottish traditions. This popularization might seem to trivialize the legend, transforming it into entertainment divorced from its original spiritual and cultural contexts. Yet, the enthusiasm with which modern audiences embrace the Sluagh mythology suggests that something in the basic concept remains viscerally powerful and psychologically resonant regardless of historical or cultural context. Modern horror and dark fantasy writers are drawn to the Sluagh because the fundamental concept, beings driven by an incomprehensible hunger, rejected by all frameworks of meaning and belonging, eternally hunting, articulates anxieties that remain central to human consciousness, even in radically transformed social and technological contexts. The Sluagh, translated into modern settings and adapted for contemporary narrative frameworks, continues to generate the sense of primal dread and existential terror that made the legend powerful in medieval Ireland. The psychological appeal of the Sluagh mythology in modern contexts connects to contemporary anxieties about meaning, belonging, and the possibility of existing outside social and moral frameworks. Modern individuals, particularly in industrialized societies, often experience profound concerns about their place in systems that can feel incomprehensibly large, impersonal, and indifferent to individual existence. The terror of being rejected, excluded, or cast out by every system that might provide meaning or protection is a recognizably modern anxiety, even if the historical context has radically changed from medieval times. The Sluagh, as beings utterly rejected by all systems of meaning and belonging, articulate this anxiety with extraordinary power. They represent the possibility of existing in a state of absolute rejection and alienation, of being so fundamentally unwanted that no system, spiritual, social, or physical, would accept one's presence. For modern individuals struggling with feelings of alienation or marginalization, the Sluagh mythology provides a narrative framework that legitimizes and articulates anxieties that might otherwise seem incomprehensible or shameful. The Sluagh mythology also persists in modern culture because it addresses fundamental anxieties about death that remain utterly unchanged, despite centuries of medical and technological advancement. Modern medicine has transformed death from an intimate household experience into a clinical event, often occurring in hospital settings under professional medical supervision. Yet this transformation has not eliminated the fundamental terror that death represents, or the profound psychological challenge that confronting mortality presents for human consciousness. The Sluagh, eternally hunting for souls at the moment of death, represents a continuation of ancient anxieties about whether death will be peaceful or violent, whether one's soul will be protected or vulnerable, whether the transition between existence and non-existence will be gentle or traumatic. Modern individuals, despite living in a world where death seems more distant and more medicalized than ever before, continue to experience these anxieties in profound ways. The Sluagh mythology provides a narrative framework for articulating and working through these deeply persistent fears about mortality and the moment when consciousness ceases. The legend's relevance has also been reinforced by anthropological and psychological study, demonstrating that many of the protective practices and beliefs associated with the Sluagh mythology were not merely superstitious, but reflected sophisticated understandings of human psychology and effective strategies for managing grief and trauma. The ritualistic closing of Western windows, the maintenance of constant vigils, the presence of spiritual specialists and community members. These practices, while grounded in supernatural belief, also served important psychological and social functions. Modern understanding of grief, trauma, and ritual has revealed that many traditional practices associated with death were actually quite effective at managing psychological distress and facilitating healthy processing of loss. The Sluagh mythology, viewed through this lens, can be understood not merely as primitive superstition, but as embodying genuine wisdom about human needs during moments of profound vulnerability and loss. This reinterpretation of the mythology through modern psychological frameworks has made it relevant even to individuals skeptical of literal supernatural belief. The environmental and ecological dimensions of modern Sluagh interpretations also deserve attention. Contemporary environmental concerns about humanity's relationship with nature have led some modern interpreters to see in the Sluagh mythology a metaphor for ecological consequences. The host as a manifestation of nature's fury at human violation and desecration. The westerly direction as representing the return of what humans have expelled or rejected. In this interpretation, the Sluagh mythology becomes a warning about the consequences of treating the natural world with contempt or as a resource to be exploited without restraint. The legend speaks to modern anxieties about environmental destruction and ecological collapse, articulating through supernatural narrative what might otherwise remain abstract or intellectually comprehensible, but emotionally distant. This environmental interpretation of the Sluagh mythology, while certainly not present in medieval sources, demonstrates how living mythologies can be reinterpreted to address contemporary concerns while maintaining their basic narrative and psychological power. The persistence of the Sluagh mythology in modern spiritual and esoteric circles also reflects how traditional beliefs adapt and persist, even in contexts of radical modernization and scientific advancement. Contemporary practitioners of traditional witchcraft, paganism, and other forms of alternative spirituality often incorporate references to the Sluagh and other Celtic entities into their spiritual frameworks and practices. These modern practitioners are not attempting to recreate medieval belief systems wholesale, but rather drawing upon traditional mythologies as resources for developing spiritualities that feel authentic and historically grounded. The Sluagh, in these contexts, represents a connection to pre-modern ways of understanding the supernatural and the spiritual, a link to traditions that predate and transcend Christian and scientific frameworks. This use of the Sluagh mythology in contemporary spiritual contexts represents another form of cultural persistence. The legend remaining alive, not because people literally believe in the host's supernatural hunting, but because the mythology provides meaningful frameworks for engaging with fundamental questions about death, judgment, and consequence that remain eternally relevant to human consciousness. We have journeyed together through the landscape of the Sluagh, through the liminal spaces where the boundaries between worlds grow thin, through the terrifying moment when the damned emerge from the western darkness, through centuries of testimony and tradition that preserve the memory of these entities, and the desperate attempts to resist their hunger. We have explored the nature of the Sluagh, traced their origins, documented their hunting methods, examined the protective practices developed against them, and considered what their legend reveals about the human relationship with death, morality, and the possibility of ultimate rejection and alienation. Throughout this journey, a profound truth has emerged. The Sluagh represent far more than a simple ghost story told to frighten children or a supernatural threat faced by medieval peoples. The legend of the host embodies a complete cosmological and philosophical framework for understanding the most fundamental and most terrifying aspects of human existence. The Sluagh mythology, in all its regional variations and historical transformations, represents humanity's attempt to articulate something that resists clear articulation: the terror of existing outside all systems of meaning and belonging. In our modern world, this remains profoundly relevant, even for those who would never claim literal belief in supernatural entities. We live in an age of unprecedented individual choice and personal autonomy, yet simultaneously, we experience profound anxiety about belonging, about meaning, about whether we have violated bonds that might result in our rejection from all communities and frameworks of significance. The Sluagh, eternally hunting because they were eternally rejected, express this anxiety with terrible clarity. They represent the possibility of a life lived in complete isolation from meaningful systems, a state of permanent hunger that no achievement could ever satisfy, because the fundamental barriers to belonging cannot be overcome. In this sense, the Sluagh are not merely creatures of medieval folklore, but articulations of deeply modern psychological experiences and existential fears. The persistence of the Sluagh mythology across centuries and through radical social transformation suggests something crucial about how human consciousness works and how we process existential terror. Mythologies do not persist merely because of cultural inertia or because communities lack the sophistication to abandon outdated beliefs. Mythologies persist because they address something fundamental about how human minds work and what narratives we need to make sense of our experience. The Sluagh mythology has endured because it speaks to truths about death, judgment, consequence, and the possibility of ultimate alienation that remain eternally relevant regardless of historical context or technological advancement. Modern individuals living in cities with electric lights and access to advanced medicine remain vulnerable to the same fundamental anxieties about death and rejection that animated the people who created and maintained the Sluagh legend centuries ago. The protective practices developed against the Sluagh reveal another profound truth: that communities can develop strategies for resisting even forces that seem incomprehensibly powerful and ultimately inevitable. The closing of western windows, the placement of iron objects, the maintenance of constant vigils, the gathering of community members around the dying. These practices represent human resilience in the face of apparent helplessness. They embody the principle that even when confronting forces beyond complete control or full understanding, deliberate action, community cooperation, and spiritual commitment can potentially mitigate danger and preserve what matters most. This message of resilience through community action and ritual practice remains as relevant in the modern world as it was in medieval times, perhaps more so in an age when individuals often feel isolated and when traditional community structures have been substantially weakened by modernization and technological transformation. The regional variations of the Sluagh mythology also reveal how living traditions adapt and evolve while maintaining their essential character. The Highlands Sluagh differed from the Lowlands Sluagh. The coastal host differed from inland manifestations. Urban understandings diverged from rural beliefs. Yet across all these variations, the core elements remained constant: rejection, hunger, the hunt for dying souls, and the approach from the West. This pattern demonstrates that genuine tradition is not static or frozen, but remains living and responsive to local context while maintaining its fundamental meaning and power. In our contemporary world, where many traditional practices and narratives seem to have lost relevance or meaning, the Sluagh mythology offers a model of how deep cultural narratives can remain vital and significant even as they adapt and evolve to address new circumstances and new audiences. The journey through the Sluagh legend also reveals something profound about the relationship between darkness and light, between what can be known and what must remain mysterious. The Sluagh exist at the boundary between worlds, in the spaces that defy clear understanding or simple categorization. They are neither purely material nor purely spiritual, neither completely hostile nor comprehensible as benevolent, neither fully knowable nor entirely beyond human understanding. In a modern world that often demands absolute clarity and complete certainty, the Sluagh mythology reminds us that reality contains depths that resist complete comprehension, and that some of the most important truths about existence can only be approached through narrative, myth, and symbol, rather than through rational analysis alone. The darkness from which the Sluagh emerge is not mere absence of light, but presence of something alien and profound that human consciousness must learn to inhabit and navigate. As we conclude this exploration, it remains important to recognize that the Sluagh mythology is not merely a historical artifact to be studied and documented, but a living tradition that continues to speak to contemporary audiences and to influence how we understand death, community, protection, and the consequences of human action. The legend persists in oral tradition among those who maintain connection to Celtic cultural heritage. It appears in modern literature and film reaching audiences worldwide. It influences contemporary spiritual practitioners seeking authentic connection to pre-modern traditions. And it continues to inspire scholars, folklorists, and cultural historians investigating how human consciousness processes the ultimate mysteries of existence. The darkness from which the Sluagh emerge never fully fades because the fundamental human encounters with mortality, judgment, and the possibility of ultimate rejection remain eternally present in human consciousness. We close our journey knowing that somewhere in the western darkness, the host still flies, still hunts, still embodies the deepest human fears about death and what comes after. The legend endures because we remain vulnerable to these fears, and we remain human because we must continually find new ways to resist, understand, and ultimately transcend them. Thank you for joining us at Echoes of the Old World in this journey through one of humanity's most profound and most terrifying mythologies. Subscribe to our channel to explore more forgotten histories and neglected narratives that shaped human consciousness. Together, we keep alive the voices of those who came before and honor the depths from which all meaningful culture emerges.